It's really an honor for me to be here today and to talk about the genesis of Another World. This game was created 20 years ago, and at the time, I couldn't have imagined that it would stay in the heart of many. My objective today is to give you a clear view of the origins of a game, how things were done, and in what order, how ideas appeared, and very importantly, in what context. We also consider the periods of doubt and the obstacles I met along the way. As curious as it seems, I started to create the game without knowing what it would be. The creation of this game was an improvisation, and that was not clear at the time, but in retrospect, 20 years later, I can see a parallel with theater improvisation. Because in theater improvisation, the actors have to follow predefined rules, and they must respect them and play along with them. For Another World, I set some very strong constraints, like using polygons, and also, in improvisation, we develop the story layer by layer without knowing where it is going precisely. That is what happened for Another World. That's why I'd like to present the creative process chronologically, if that's okay with you. So, the talk will be like a diary divided in 4 parts. First, I will talk about the ignition, the desire that sparked the development. Then, we will look at the technology behind the game, how it shaped the design, and give a solid foundation to create it. Then, I will talk about the creation of the game itself, gameplay, graphics, animation, and story. Then, the publishing aspects. As far as possible, I will describe the context of the creation and how the flourishing of ideas is as important as ideas themselves. First, let's brush on the context. We are in July 1989. It is the Amiga era. I'm 22 years old, still living in my parents' house. Okay, this photo was taken in 1991 at the end of the development, but in 1989, there will be no less mess, unfortunately. I had been creating various games since 1983 on various platforms like Auric One, Amstrad, and of course, Amiga. The average time to create this game was from 3 weeks to 6 months. None has been really successful. And I had just finished creating all the graphics and animation for Future Wars, which is a game designed by Punctuation. And Dragon's Lair was just released on Amiga, and its huge animations really impressed me. I was wondering how to do this. This game was purely bitmap. It was running on 8 floppy disks. But it inspired me, technically speaking, to base a 2D game on a polygon drawing technology. Why polygons? Polygons mean low memory usage, and therefore it can cover huge part of the screen with very few data. It seemed very advantageous, and I felt it could open new horizons. Also, a new thing that came with the Amiga was the ability to connect a Genlock. What's a Genlock? A Genlock is a hardware that enables you to put a video behind the picture. The picture which is displayed on the screen, of course. And I had seen a demo of this in a shop, and this led me to a conclusion that if I could connect a video camcorder to the Amiga with this hardware, I could create realistic animation with polygons by using the classical technique of rotoscoping. Well, an idea is an idea, and it needed to become real to have any value. But there was one crucial question. Was it possible to draw enough polygons at the right speed? I hadn't coded for 2 years, and my last experience with C language was a disaster. Yes, I promise. It was really depressing, almost. So I chose to code in assembly language, which was familiar to me, and I prototyped a routine which drew a few polygons at 60 frames per second. And on strengthening the system, that reduced to 20 frames per second, and that was good enough to go further. So I decided that the graphics unit would be polygons and polygons only. That was the constraint. This was a major turning point in the creation of a game. It was like a dogma. I was sure that polygons were the greatest thing in the world. I was obsessed by these polygons, how this car would look in polygons, how would a potato look in polygons, and how a crowd would look in polygon. Well, something wrong. What the hell is this? Aha, okay. Pixigon. What's a Pixigon? It's a polygon so small that it has the size of a pixel. I was used to doing some pixel art, but dealing with flat surfaces was something new. The first time I used polygons to create graphics, I was spending hours and hours drawing a pixel with polygons. The clock was ticking, and months later, I was still on the first level. That was discouraging, and after coding a third of the game, I reverted to using some bitmap when I needed details for some backgrounds. But finally, the whole game uses only 10 bitmaps. As you see, this choice brought new obstacles, especially for detailed backgrounds. But it opened new horizons for animation. Again, what I would create, I strictly didn't know. I can tell you, I tried, and it was a nightmare because it was too difficult to design without knowing precisely the technical limits. I just knew that I wanted to create a game with a cinematic feeling on a science fiction theme with the rhythm of a movie. But not especially having a story. I mean, a well-defined script. I was thinking more in terms of mood, ambience, movie, but no story. Yes, because it was not the story side that interested me the most, but the rhythm and the narrative tension, which is connected, but different from a story. This is an important point. I could have said, I want to create a game where a scientist is projected into an unknown universe where he will meet a friend who will help him all along the game, and sure, the hero will have red hair. And in the end, he will almost die. But I had no idea of this at the time. I was stuck. It drove me to the conclusion that the only way to solve this situation was to produce. But no specific tools for polygons existed. And I had to create the whole game system from scratch too. Let's see the tools used to create the game. There are two aspects. One, a polygon editor to edit all graphics, and the other was a homemade editor for the homemade interpreted language. This interpreted language was used to code all the game logic. The tool was coded partly in GFA Basic and in assembly language. Basic, easy to learn, was used to create the user interface since I didn't need performance. The assembly language was used only for the core game engine. Let's see the graphic editor. On the bottom are all the tools. It's possible to create an object, a polygon, add a point, move a point, change its color. The idea was to code a tool where every polygon can be grouped together so that it can be easily manipulated, and where each group of polygons can be grouped together again like Russian dolls. Here you can see that Lester is made of several polygons, but his head is another group of polygons. There was a special color which enabled transparency. Indeed, that was a color palette trick, and it is how I added some light effects. So that's for the graphic side. And then, just by hitting a key, I was able to switch from the graphic editor to the code editor, which lead us to the specific language of the game. I made the choice of an interpreted language because in 1985, I designed this for a game called Infernal Runner. This was really much easier to program than in assembly language. The big advantage is that the game would be interpreted in real time, so no compiling was necessary to run the game. That was a key feature to be efficient during its creation. What is more, the connection between the two editors was even tighter. What we see on the left is the visualization of the drawing code on the right. I could move the graphics, and it would modify the code, and vice versa. Okay. In the graphic editor, it was also possible to run step by step a part of the program. The key feature is that the interpreted language has a special instruction to slice the code into time blocks. It is the break instruction. You can see the break instruction here, and this instruction pauses the code until the next game loop. And the draw function just draws an object from the polygon editor. This way, the interpreted code itself became also an animation sequencer. And it was possible to associate more complex code to manage all the gameplay interaction. The language has few instructions, very simple and minimalism, like the assembly language, but more readable. The problem was that no commands were possible, and the variable name was like V251, and it carried just a number and no description. So the solution I used was to note that each variable was on paper. And I have a full documentation. I still have it today. And it works. So without entering into details, the engine allows to run small piece of interpreted code sequentially on separate tracks, a little bit like a clip in Flash, but without graphics. So it was very easy to manage timing and sequence inside the code. Hence, we have one track for character displacement, one track to manage the pad control, one track to manage the laser shot. So I had my tools and the game engine. I learned their limits, like frame rate, number of colors, memory limits. And regarding the improvisation process, I accept these limits as a new constraint. So now I was not lost, and I can build the game with these limits in mind. What's wrong again? Okay. No common data between levels. Each time I started a new level, I copied the previous one to keep the basics, like controls, characters, behavior, and graphics. And indeed, it was a major failure in the game development, since for every change I was making on generic things, I had to do it on all files. For example, each time Lester's behavior changed, I had to change it for the all 5 levels. And later, when I did a lot of tuning, this became a nightmare. So let's go to the game creation. The introduction was a landmark because it validated the use of polygons and the use of the interpreted language. And the whole thing took only 84 kilobytes. Yes, it's small. It was a way, so this introduction was a way to explore the dynamic of the pictures in a cinematic style, and especially the transition between cuts. And also, this was a way to immerse myself in the universe, which was not existing before. And it was the first layer of the improvisation process. Hence, I had the first stepping stone for the story. I had too much belief in rotoscoping. I created some great scenes with it, but in the end, there are only 6 scenes that use this technique in the introduction, and the rest of the game. In the rest of the game, only the gun sequence and the walk and run of Lester was made with this technique. I got the best result from unmade animation, like the lightning sequence. Anyway, this confirmed that polygon animation was great, but rotoscoping itself was, well, a little bit too limited. The main rule I followed during the creation of a game was to listen my inner feeling. What do I feel right now? What does it suggest to me? That's why doing things in chronological order made things coherent. At that moment, it was not clear, but creating a game all alone brought a feeling of loneliness, which you can also find in the game. And I was always trying to consider myself as a player of a game who knew nothing about it. Each time I was asking myself, what would I love to experience? And then, as a creator, how can I surprise and break my initial expectation? Surprising the player was important. Playing with the pacing was a top objective. The hero just disappeared, and from that point, I just knew that he would be teleported into another world. But where? I thought in the air, in free fall first, but then I thought it would be much more surprising and unearthly to make him appear underwater. Which gave another stunning moment when he emerged on the surface of a totally unknown place that is clearly not Earth, since there are 2 moons in the sky. Is Jordan there? Okay. The choice to do a 2D game came naturally. I was a big fan of Karateka on Apple II, and that was a kind of game I felt comfortable to create, so I went this way. So what's the player doing? All gameplay activity is very traditional in many aspects. You fight, you run, you jump, you flee, you die. But the environment suggests a narrative and gives more meaning to these basic actions. The color palette. Only 16 in total, and it was very difficult to define. A whole week was needed to define the first color palette. 1 week full time for 16 colors. A determining choice for the atmosphere of the game. Some colors are sometimes used both for the landscape and for the character. For instance, the hero's flesh color was also used to suggest the sunset reflected on the rock. Having only 16 colors is very restrictive. You could understand my need to optimize the use of each color, as each hue had multiple uses. Giving Lester dark hair would have been an easy solution. But I didn't want him to look too much like me. Yes, because I was filming myself to create animation, and the hero was physically nearly identical to me. It was disturbing. So I didn't want to see myself running on the screen, being killed by a slug or whatever. So I decided to choose a totally different color, red, because I was sure that this color would be very useful in many pictures, and also I also wanted Lester to stand out from the backgrounds. And I will never have red hair. Only blue hair sometime. So, during the creation of this part, I defined the vocabulary used through the whole game. We will see this right now. Creating a 2D game limits the gameplay to one plane, but it gives the advantage of exploiting more freely the depth at the front and the back of the scene for something else. This in order to build narrative without interrupting player activity. Here, the black beast can be seen from the beginning, so the player can start to think about it. So it's really a suggestion of a story. And what happens in the background suddenly becomes real for the player. This cutscene is very short this cutscene is very short and can be seen as punctuating to give emphasis to a major event, which is a turning point in the pacing. So I played with the rhythm of the action. We go from a slow rhythm before the creature arrives to a fast and a very stressful situation, with a moment of suspension when you have to backtrack. Then, to reach the climax, where another punctuation surprise again the player. Here we've reached the end of part one, which ends on a cliffhanger for the player, but also for myself. And regarding the improvisation process, after that point, I didn't know what would happen next. I just knew that the next scene would be in a jail, but the idea of giving Lester a friend hadn't come to me yet. How this guy looked under his costume, I did not know. So in the jail, the first thing I did was to remove his clothes to know what he looked like. And then I introduced the most important character in the game, the friend. He helps the player, but I was still not thinking about him being a focus of the game. You will notice that this cut is the only moment where you can see the body in close-up. And this picture is enough for the player to project his face on the small-sized character. As I say often, the real media is the player's memory and imagination. So seeing once is enough to complete the mental picture of the game universe in his mind. Okay. I always loved the way they render laser beams in Star Wars movies, and they were very expressive visually, with a lot of dynamism, and I always wanted to see this in a game. Okay, here is how a nice idea can arise from constraints. I was thinking more about the core gameplay, something around fighting, but also a means for protection. After the escape from jail, the initial idea was to progress from one shelter to another to avoid shots fired by the guard. It was abandoned because it was too complicated to manage the death. In the end, the development of defense strategy brought me the concept of protective fields, which are shelters generated by the player himself. This creates very interesting gameplay combinations. Which lead to the plasma ball, which is the third stage of weaponry, like a Swiss knife, a little bit. And where is this? In retrospect, this is one aspect I'm very proud of because the player has to choose from different strategies. The player can use a small shot immediately, but without protection, or risk his life creating a shield, and ultimately even taking more time to create plasma to destroy enemy shields or doors. So somehow this became the building blocks to different types of gameplay. After designing my weaponry, I needed to develop exploratory notions. Everything up to this point was on a single level. On a single level on the screen, I mean. But I felt limited. Having several stages in a game screen would bring more tactics and puzzles. But the difficulty was to create character animation and collision on stairs. How could I do this with little effort? I was thinking of a real elevator, but another idea came. Why not create a kind of teleporter to switch from level to level just by drawing a few vertical polygons in Leicester's color? I realized that I could create a very nice impression of motion, something that was inspired by Japanese manga animation, in which we get an impression of high-speed movement just by stretching lines. This is the end of the jail level, where the body and Lester are separated. At this point, I realized that I couldn't let him go without finding him again. I felt attached to him. Okay, I only did 1/3 of the game, and at this rhythm, I would have 2 more years of work, which was really depressing. From that point, I decided to work more. and to not get lost in details. Some backgrounds were more flattened. So I got organized and created a set of graphic blocks I could reuse to create detailed backgrounds faster. From that point, I focus more on puzzles, creating variations using the building blocks I had at my disposal. And each time, I was trying to bring a new idea. The friend became the center of the story, with a succession of twists where Lester and his friend help each other. I never wanted, at the beginning, to create a game about the relationship between two strangers, but the improvisation led me naturally to this. Producing is a source of inspiration in itself. Then I extended the use of parallel action to the foreground. Here, when the player leaves the jail, we can see the friend being chased by guards in the foreground. This has the same effect as a close-up, but without breaking the player's activity. On the first level, I discovered the pleasure of modulating the pacing. But now I was playing around with it. For example, to modulate the pacing, I used laser beams to give different rhythm, enabling me to modulate the tension, a little bit like music score. Here is an animation with 5 frames. The laser beam comes from the foreground, giving the impression of a raging battle. Ha ha ha. Okay. Publishing. It was time to see if a publisher would be interested in the game. I met Delphine Software, who were interested, but I wanted to meet another publisher, which was, in fact, the French headquarters of Virgin Games. Here was a major fork during the creation of a game, the moment where another world could have changed drastically. It could have become a point and click. It was, yeah. I love point and click. And the editorial director said, if you want to make it a hit, make it less difficult by transforming it to a point and click. So it was the golden era of this kind of game. And as always, being full of doubt, he almost convinced me. So, Future Wars, the previous game I did, was a point and click. I love point and click, as I said. However, I don't like doing things twice. And the effort to convert it would have been too huge. Also, some friends who played the game really loved it. So I maintained my direction. Yeah. And finally, the game was published by Delphine Software, who were not an international publisher, but were fully supportive of the creation. They trusted their game creators and were not intrusive into the design process, which was rare and extremely valuable. Time to think about the end. How would I conclude the game? I didn't know. And at this point, I had an agreement for its release in November. I had done 3/4 of the game. And it was really the time to step back and review the overall pacing, how I wanted it to evolve to the end. So the idea was to envision the finished game so as to balance the later stage with the rest. I drew a curve of all major past events and activity for the player and decided to play with contrasting situations and change of pace, which lead to the arena scene and which lead to the an up and down rhythm. So, and yes, the cover illustration, I have tales to tell about this. Throughout my career, cover illustration has been a major issue and a huge source of disappointment. I always consider the cover as the continuity of the game. And it is the first bond between it and the player. The publishers of my previous games had the habit to impose artwork on me. Like this, or this, or even this. Well, those games were particularly bad, by the way. Over the years, I'd become passionate about illustration to the point that I actually wanted to become an illustrator. So, for another world, I didn't want to miss the opportunity of doing it myself. Being published by Delphine Software was fortunate. They were fine for me to create the cover illustration. But doing this while creating the game was really difficult as I was already under pressure to finish the game for Christmas. It took me 3 weeks that, quite honestly, I didn't have. One of the big issues for the first release in 1991 was the lack of playtest. Delphine Software were not doing a lot of playtesting at the time, and we had only 2 test sessions. And that was for the beginning of the game only. I fixed some major issues, but the game was really unbalanced. Later, when Interplay became the US publisher, they did a lot of playtesting. And the game underwent a second polishing. I fixed a lot of bugs and removed some sources of frustration. However, they asked me to make the game longer, and some parts became more difficult. Okay. Interplay wanted to replace the original music used on the Amiga version with new music for the Super Nintendo. And I disagreed. This was a serious source of conflict as they were doing the porting for the game, and the situation drove me totally crazy. The music matched so well the visuals. This led to a big transatlantic fight by fax, lasting several weeks. And after exchanging a number of faxes, I decided I'd use a new strategy. This consisted in sending an infinite fax. What's an infinite fax? It's a long strip of paper where the beginning is stuck to the end using an adhesive strip. such that it loops around the fax machine endlessly. And of course, I sent it in the dead of night in Los Angeles. So you could imagine their surprise when they arrived at work in the morning and found reams of paper repeating the message, keep the original intro music. This didn't help. They didn't change their mind until Delphine Software got involved and said that legally they had no right to impose their choice of music. And the discussion was closed. Having a game on console had its own constraints. One of these was censorship. Another word could have ended up in a sex shop. Yes, there is an extremely odd thing featuring nudity. So you get the drift. The alien women were totally naked. And here is the cause for concern. The butt crack was too explicit. So I considered using another infinite fax with the message, keep the original crack on the alien ass. However, the console manufacturer gave me no choice. I didn't send the fax. So to limit the change, I had to remove only these 3 pixels to suggest a bathing suit. At the end of the development, I was exhausted. And this is probably the reason Lester was almost dying in the end. Okay. So thank you. We have seen the whole process from the origins to a finished product, how improvisation process was important in the creation of this game. And I didn't talk about the music and the sound because timing was too short. Well, the game has lived on longer than I originally thought, and has been released on many platforms. So I have a little surprise, as this is the 20th anniversary. The game will be ported to iPad. So. And so, yes, there is a little prototype here. So, and now, if you have any question, well, I really want to answer to your question if you have. So.